Amana colonies, remaining faithful to a dream. The history of the Amana colonies, a national historic landmark and one of America's longest-lived communal societies, begins in 1714 in the villages of Germany and continues today in eastern Iowa. In turbulent 18th century Germany, in the midst of a religious movement called Pietism, two men, Eberhard L. Gruber and Johann F. Rock, advocated faith renewal through reflection, prayer, and Bible study. Their belief, one shared of many other pietists, was that God, through the Holy Spirit, would inspire individuals to speak. This gift of inspiration or prophecy was the basis of a religious group that began meeting in 1714 and became known as the Community of True Inspiration. Though the Inspirationalists sought to avoid conflict, they were prosecuted for their beliefs. Eventually, the Inspirationalists found refuge in central Germany, settling on several estates, including the 13th century Ronenberg Castle. Ronenberg Castle. Seeking freedom. Persecution and an economic depression in Germany forced the community to begin searching for a new home. Led by Christian Metz, they hoped to find religious freedom in America and left Germany in 1843 through 1844. Community members pooled their resources and purchased 5,000 acres near Buffalo, New York. By working cooperatively and sharing their property, the community, then numbering 1,200 people, was able to carve out a relatively comfortable living. They called their community the Ebenezer Society and adopted a constitution that formalized their communal way of life. When more farmland was needed for the growing community, the Inspirationalists looked west, where attractively priced land was available. One valley on the Iowa River seemed particularly promising. Here was fertile soil, stone, wood, and water, enough to build a community of their dreams. Remaining true, in 1855 they arrived in Iowa, after an inspired testimony commanded the people to call their village Bleib treu, or remain faithful. The leaders chose the name Amana from the Song of Solomon 4:8. Amana means to remain true. 6 villages were established, a mile or two apart, across a river valley tract of some 26,000 acres. Amana, East Amana, West Amana, South Amana, High Amana, and Middle Amana. The village of Homestead was added in 1861, giving the colonies access to the railroad. Communal life. In the 7 villages, residents received housing, medical care, meals, all household necessities, and schooling for their children. Property and resources were shared. Men and women were assigned jobs by their village council of brethren. No one received a wage. No one needed one. Farming and the production of wool and calico supported the community. But village enterprises, everything from clockmaking to brewing, were vital, and well-crafted products became the hallmark of the Amanas. Craftsmen took special pride in their work as a testament of both their faith and their community spirit. Up before dawn, called to work by the gentle tolling of the bell in the village tower, the unhurried routine of life in old Amana was paced very differently than today. Amana churches, located in the center of each village, built of brick or stone, have no stained glass windows, no steeple or spire, and reflect the ethos of simplicity and humility. Inspirationalists attended worship services 11 times a day, their quiet worship punctuating the day. Over 50 communal kitchens provided 3 daily meals, as well as a mid-morning and mid-afternoon snack for all the colonists. These kitchens were operated by the women of the colony. They were well supplied by the village smokehouse, bakery, ice house, and dairy, by huge gardens, orchards, and vineyards maintained by the villagers. Children attended school 6 days a week, year-round, until the age of 14. Boys were assigned jobs on the farm or in the craft shops, while girls were assigned to a communal kitchen or garden. A few boys were sent to college for training as teachers, doctors, and dentists. In 1932, amidst America's Great Depression, Amana set aside its communal way of life. A ruinous farm market and changes in the rural economy contributed, but what finally propelled the change was a strong desire on the part of residents to maintain their community. By 1932, the communal way of life was seen as a barrier to achieving individual goals. So rather than leave or watch their children leave, they changed. They established the Amana Society Incorporated, a profit-sharing corporation to manage the farmlands, the mill, and the larger enterprises. Private enterprise was encouraged. The Amana Church was maintained. Amana colonies today. Today, the 7 villages of the Amana colonies represent an American dream come true, a thriving community founded by religious faith and community spirit. Declared a National Historic Landmark in 1965, the Amana colonies attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, all of whom could come to see and enjoy a place where the past is cherished and where hospitality is a way of life. Evocative of another age, the streets of the Amana colonies and their historic brick, stone, and clapboard homes, their flower and vegetable gardens, the lanterns, and walkways recall an Amana of yesterday, but a vibrant community celebrating both its past and its future is here today for you to experience. The story of Ebenezer. Thus far has the Lord helped us. 1 Samuel 7:12. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and called its name Ebenezer, saying, Thus far the Lord has helped us. This is the third in a series of Willkommen featured stories in Amana's early leaders and what led them to America. In the early afternoon of October 26, 1842, 4 men and a boy stood on a muddy street in New York City. They spoke no English. They knew very little of the customs and culture of the land. They had yet to recover from their grueling voyage. Yet before them was an incredible challenge, for they were charged with finding a new home in a new land for over 1,000 people. Christian Metz, Gottlieb Ackermann, William Noel, George Weber, and his 11-year-old son Ferdinand had arrived bearing the hopes and dreams of their German religious community. Like so many who have come to America, before and since, the travelers were searching for more than a place to live. They were searching for the freedom to worship, and they believed as they believed, and to live as they wish. The Inspirationist community in Germany and in Switzerland had been persecuted for years, refusing to join the established Lutheran or Swiss Reformed churches, refusing to swear oaths against their own religious views, refusing to bear arms in military service, and objecting to forced baptism of their children. The Inspirationalists were pushed from one town to the next, imprisoned, pilloried, beaten, taxed, thrown out of jobs and craft guilds. Finally, in 1842, the group decided to leave Europe for the United States. I believe at that time it was not the United States, but it was actually the United States of America. It was before the Civil War, anyway. Finally, in 1842, the group decided to leave Europe. A move triggered by a period of especially tense persecution. Their hope was to find freedom in America. Their plan was for all to contribute to buy one large tract of land and together farm, weave wool, and operate various craft enterprises there. Though they had great hopes, they were realistic. No one underestimated the effort it would take. As community leader Christian Metz wrote afterward in his journal, "It is now His, the Lord's, holy will to lead the entire community, heretofore scattered in various directions, a great distance away. My heart often trembled when considering such an extraordinary upheaval of the congregation and their accommodations." Upheaval was the very word to describe the next few years. The first task, finding land, proved difficult enough. After hearing about land for sale in western New York, the scouting party headed for Buffalo. There they contacted a land agent who showed them a tract on Buffalo Creek. After looking at other sites and traveling as far as Ohio, Metz, Weber, and the others entered into negotiation to buy 5,000 acres on Buffalo Creek. Hampered by their language barrier and unsure of American law, the negotiations were complicated and, as it turns out, based upon a lie. The Ogden Land Company, with which they were dealing, did not have clear title of the land and would not for 4 more years, according to the research of Amana's historian Peter Holmley, whose book, The Amana People, provides an excellent account of this difficult period. Meanwhile, back in Germany, letters assuring their friends of the scouts' safe arrival did not appear, and the rumor spread that their ship had gone down. Wilhelm Moschrel wrote Metz and the others, "After much yearning and after many a deep sigh, we finally, on November 24th, received word that your ship had arrived safely in New York on October 26th. This joyous news spread rapidly from mouth to mouth, from house to house, like an electric spark, and the hope of soon receiving a letter from you invigorated us anew. Morshell's letter is included in the community history called The Inspirations History, Part 3, written by Gottlieb Scheuner and translated by Jeanette W. Zuber. Scheuner was a boy when his family was among those who wished to go to America and were anxiously awaiting for word. He wrote later that he remembered the exact moment when he heard that the scouting party was safe in New York. He knew then that his own adventure was about to begin. Within the next few weeks, the community in Germany received letters describing New York, the land they were attempting to purchase. I think at that time, instead of purchase, it would have been to actually buy, because this would have been before the Civil War. Purchase only applies to the bankruptcy. Within the next few weeks, the community in Germany received letters describing New York, the land where they were attempting to purchase, and the land they were attempting to buy, and of their hopes and dreams. The letters fueled excitement as inspirationalist Theobald Heimberger wrote to other members of the community who were contemplating the move. "O brethren, let us not continue talking and writing about it idly. Now it is serious. The hour has come. God makes ready." Met's voyage, 40 days on the stormy Atlantic, followed by an ice-cold winter in New York, prompted him to send detailed instructions to community members on what to expect, what clothing, medicines, food, and provisions to bring. Metz, Noe, Ackerman, and Weber had been so ill on the voyage that young Ferdinand, the only one who weathered it well, had to look after them. Mindful of this, Metz cautioned against the elderly or infirm attempting the journey. Meanwhile, in Germany, property was being sold to raise cash for passage and for the establishment in America. Much of the property they were living on in Germany had been leased, so selling livestock and other property became crucial. The plan all along had been for all members to pool their resources, and truly this was the best option, as it allowed even the poorest community members to immigrate. Had they not done so, the endeavor might have floundered at the start, notes historian translator Jan Zuber. The Inspirations History and Metzer's autobiographical accounts supports this conclusion. By April 1843, the first group of 52 settlers arrived. Over 800 inspirationalists came to America within the first few years. Small groups would join them afterward for another decade or so, with a second wave of more than 100 arriving in the 1960s. Did everyone come? Just about, Zuber tells us. There were several elderly members and a few families who did not want to make the trip, but for the most part, the community was transplanted. Ebenezer. That first winter of 1842-1843, before the rest began to arrive, Metzer, Noe, Ackerman, and Weber spent their days planning. They discussed how the community might function in the new world. Metzer urged that they continue the practice of pooling their cash and working cooperatively together as a community. At least for the first few years, seeing the rough countryside and how much work would be required, they worried how the oldest and the poorest would fare. They felt that a cooperative community like the early Christian church in Luke's Acts of the Apostles would have been the best path to success for all and would allow them to stay together, underlying a deep concern that should they fail, the members would scatter and the fellowship they felt God had blessed would be lost. Outlining their thoughts, they sent letters to Germany describing their ideas. After some discussion, it was decided that they would try this for 3 years. Christian Metzer, a prolific poet, wrote a poem about Ebenezer, which contained this verse: "You shall call it Ebenezer, hitherto the Lord hath helped. He helped us through upon our journey, and rescued us all of our fear. Our paths and ways are wonder filled. To end makes all beginnings clear." Translated by Janet W. Zuber. They built 6 villages, 2 small outposts in Canada, and 4 larger villages in New York State, not all that far from Buffalo. The villages were named Middle Ebenezer, Upper Ebenezer, Lower Ebenezer, and New Ebenezer, Canada Ebenezer, and Kennenberg. At first they lived in crowded makeshift structures while they built barns and homes. Metz, a carpenter, put a door on a tiny dirt-floored shed and made it his home. Farming and wood-cutting were necessities for immediate survival, but almost from the moment they arrived, the inspirationalists built a fairly large woolen mill in Middle Ebenezer, because textile productions was a key to the community's future. Along with the woolen mill, they built flour mills and linseed oil mill, a pottery, a glassworks, a brewery, lumber mills, and a printing shop and bookbindery. As the time approached the end of the 3-year commitment to cooperative living, the debate began. Originally, it was thought that the farmland and shops could be distributed among the families, but how do they do that fairly became the question. Moreover, how do they do it so the community would remain cohesive, whole with members in the fellowship seemed nearly impossible. After much discussion and prayer, in 1845 a constitution was drafted and legally formalized the communal way of life. Members were to own land, homes, shops, and industries in common. In exchange for their labor, they would receive food, housing, fuel, medical care, household necessities, a small stipend, and schooling for their children. The Constitution mandated that the governing council of brethren, male trustees, be elected by all adults, both men and women. This was extraordinary, as allowing females to vote in any election was unheard of. It wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment acknowledging women's right to vote was ratified in America. The council system seemed to work well from the start. Elected leaders guided community business. Fortunately, several of them were very good businessmen. Things were obviously things were obviously run differently in America than in Germany, and the language was a hurdle, but the council learned and they were quick to hire help. For example, Buffalo attorney Millard Fillmore, who would later become our 13th American president, was hired to represent them in legal matters. Fate intervened and sent them a talented young German man with a good education and rock-solid Christian faith named Karl Ludwig Meyer. Meyer had worked for the German separatists of Zoar, Ohio, and after met Meyer there while visiting the group. The two corresponded, developing a friendship. Meyer joined the community in Ebenezer and quickly proved to be invaluable. His ability to write and speak English well and his talent for business enabled him to assist in many important ways. The legal wrangle with the Ogden Company marred the Ebenezer years. The history of the entanglement dates back to the early 1800s, decades before the Inspirationalists arrived, when treaties were negotiated with indigenous nations to purchase land in western New York. Here they've put negotiated with Native American tribes, but the Native American tribes are actually indigenous nations. In the early 1800s, it would not have been to purchase, but to buy land. When you're dealing with indigenous nations, it's not about buying or taking land or land ownership. As was the case then, and continued to be the case, the Native Americans, the indigenous nations, were treated shamefully by the government and by land speculators. The unsuspecting Inspirationalists would eventually learn that both they and the indigenous nations had been cheated when they discovered that the Ogden Company had no clear title. The Inspirationalists, not wanting to be a party to the dishonesty, negotiated a settlement with the indigenous nations while pressing the Ogden Company for an honest reckoning. It took 4 years to settle the matter to anyone's satisfaction. In New York, the Inspirationalists coped with all manner of crises. Frank Lanke's history of Ebenezer is filled page after page with blizzards, fire, flood, and other calamities. The worst of all came to be called the Notzeit, time of stress, when 27 people died from what they called military fever. During a 3-week period, dozens of people, young and old, fell ill. Most families suffered the loss. Christian Metz's son-in-law died, leaving his wife and 2 young daughters. Metz's journal describes days where 3 or 4 funerals were held. Undaunted, the Christian community remained resolute in their desire to pursue together the dream of creating a community of prayer in a land of peace, as Metzer described in his testimony on July 21st, 1842. Indeed, the challenges were not just physical in nature, for the community was still feeling its way. Debates over major questions such as whether or not the group should adopt celibacy for all, they decided no, and whether or not the communal way of life should be permanent and formalized in the Constitution, they decided yes. Made life interesting, if not exciting. In Ebenezer, they began to form those day-to-day routines that became almost institutionalized 2 decades later in the Amanas. They ate together in the kitchen houses, worked together on jobs, and they worshipped together daily. This system they refined, changed, and rearranged as needed, but evidently it proved worthy and workable enough so that nearly all who originally immigrated from Germany stuck with it. While they could not have left the Ebenezer village at any time, villages at any time, they stayed and made a life together there. The population grew to 1,200 people. While the Ebenezer Society, as it was called, prospered, so did Buffalo. What had once been a sleepy town some miles distant was now a fast-growing city almost within sight of the quiet villages. The villages were becoming part of an increasingly urbanized landscape, and the Inspirationalists did not care for the change. In addition, the political and social climate in New York during the pre-Civil War years was highly contentious. Pro- and anti-slavery debates, sometimes nearly violent, energized political life to a fever pitch amidst the hothouse of Christian revivalism. Abolitionist and Christian revivalist Charles F. Finney called Western New York the burned-over district because the blaze of revival had burned up all of the available fuel, in that no soul was left converted, and no one was lukewarm in their faith. Smack in the middle of this were the Inspirationalists, who were hardly lukewarm themselves. Had they spoken better English, they might have been swept up in the fray. They were afraid enough as it was. When the Inspirationalists sought to buy more land, they found that prices were beyond their means. The original 5,000 acres, while enough to sustain them, was not enough to ensure the future of the community, they felt. It certainly was not enough to provide a buffer between them and the growing city of Buffalo. In 1854, when a dispute over water rights to Buffalo Creek threatened the use of the creek as a source of water power for their mills, the resulting legal battle, which the Inspirationalists eventually won, seemed to prove the point. They needed to move west. After taking a look at the Kansas territory and finding it dry, hot, and racked by pro- and anti-slavery violence, they kept looking. In the fall of 1854, land was found in the new state of Iowa. Having learned the hard way, Metz urged that they buy as much land as they could afford right from the start. That meant they needed to raise cash. So Carl Meyer led a team that surveyed and divided the Ebenezer villages and sold them lot by lot. Over a period of 9 years, while the community used the proceeds to purchase land in Iowa, sometimes as little as 150 acres at a time, to quilt together a 26,000 acre tract. What wasn't nailed down in New York was sent to Iowa. Most importantly, the entire community archived the inspired testimonies, documents, and historical records, a precious collection that had been so carefully brought from Germany, was packed in crates and brought under watchful care to Amana. By the time the last group of inspirationalists arrived in the Amana villages, after the final sale of Ebenezer land, the Amana community was thriving. But the settlement of Amana was made possible in every way by the struggles and successes of Ebenezer. In Ebenezer, the inspirationalists learned how to cope with pioneer life. They learned how to break sod, fell timber, make brick, and cut stone in quantity enough to build not just a house, but a village. They learned how to govern themselves and how to manage a communal system so that both the community and the individual were served. In short, they learned how to work hard and succeed as a team. If Ebenezer taught them anything, it taught them the true value of cooperation and unity, lessons they would need in the coming years.